The virtual rainbow brings together LGBTQ+ youth and their families, community leaders, professionals, and healthcare providers to learn and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Zuri Moreno with TransVisible, and Zuri will tell us more about the organization, and I'll just let you take it away, Zuri.
Well, great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Deb. And hello, everyone. My name is Zuri, and my pronouns are they and them. And before we get started today, I want to do a land acknowledgement, and I want to acknowledge that anyone who is listening or ever listens to this presentation who is not Indigenous are settlers on this land. And we, as settlers on this land, need to acknowledge the impact of continued colonization in the U.S. If you're watching this outside the U.S., I'm happy to provide materials around colonization in your lands. And I want to challenge you all, if you do not know who the Indigenous folks are in your area, to find that information out. And I've provided a couple of links here. And this is, I think, the first step for many people in really recognizing settler colonialism and the continued impact that it has, and also recognizing that Indigenous people, despite the narrative that is pushed in our country, are not gone. There are thriving communities and amazing individuals doing work to decolonize the U.S. And I encourage you to learn more about how to support Indigenous movements. And I need to figure out how to move to the next. Oh, there we go. So as I said in the beginning, my name is Zuri, and as you may have noticed, I introduced myself with my pronouns. And many people do this. I'm not sure if you know of anyone who has done this, but it actually sort of like pushes against that assumption, right, that we make, that we think that we can know who someone is, the gender of another person, just by looking at them, right? And we need to push up against that assumption that is normalized in, I think, our dominant culture. And so the reality is that we all hold space in ourselves for invisible identities, and our pronouns are one of our invisible identities. Unless, of course, you're wearing a pronoun button or a pronoun shirt that display your pronouns. We can't know unless we ask, or someone can't know unless we provide that information. And although we've been socialized to believe certain things along the binary, and we're on that later, like long hair, girl, or short hair, boy, the truth is that these things aren't absolute truths, and they can even be culturally inaccurate. So I'm curious, we're just going to take a couple of, like, maybe a minute, if folks want to. I'm curious to hear like other assumptions, binary gender assumptions we make about folks, or just assumptions we make when we look at folks that you might know of. Like I gave the example of hair length being correlated with gender, but are there other things that when you start to think about it, and this is absolutely like part of our culture, like looking at someone and being like, oh, I think that I know this about that person. If you want to type that into the chat, yeah, great. Clothing, jewelry, and makeup choices, those are great examples. Yep. Yeah, that someone's genitalia and social roles like job status represent someone's gender. just wait a couple seconds to see if folks have other stuff. I had someone recently in a training say gray hair means I'm old, and not necessarily true, right? Try to look at facial expressions as much as possible. That's awesome. Great. So I just want to say that for many, we're kind of starting at a small point, right? I'm talking about pronouns, and we are going to go back out and go macro and talk about gender and what is gender. We are going to kind of start at the foundational level with a lot of this stuff. And please always type in questions in the chat if something doesn't, if you need something clarified. But with pronouns, for many transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals, honoring pronouns is a way to really show respect and support. And supporting the autonomy and the right for folks to make decisions about our bodies and ourselves. So a lot of cisgender folks, and I just want to do a vocab moment. I know maybe many folks don't know what cisgender means. We are going to get to that later. I'll do a quick piece. Cisgender is someone who identifies with the gender assigned at birth. We're going to talk about that more later. But for many cisgender folks, they've never felt or had to announce or correct pronouns. And so if you are a cisgender individual, introducing yourself with your pronouns can be really powerful and show solidarity with trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. So what are the goals for this training? We have going over some basic knowledge on transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit identities, as well as issues impacting the community. We're going to talk about pronouns, why pronouns. We're going to talk about names and ways to honor people's identity and why it matters. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. I also forgot to warn everyone that my cat sometimes gets right into the fray of things, so I will really try to make sure that that doesn't happen. But if you see a kitty cat in the corner here, that's just my cat Dogwood. So how do we make this training a success? I want here, we're talking about a topic of ways to implement in your workspace, but also ways to implement in your life. And please type in the Q&A to keep it confidential, but also type in the chat, because sometimes questions that you have, other people have, and I want this to try to feel like a safe space, even though we're online. I don't think the chat is being recorded with this training. So please try to lean a little bit into vulnerability, especially if a lot of these concepts are new to you. And how do we support success? Don't argue or debate. As you start to hear things, if there's something that I think we've all had that experience where we're like, oh, wait, what about that? Just be with that. Be like, oh, okay, I'm having a reaction to this. Where's that reaction coming from? Sort of be curious around when you have reactions to certain concepts, or when you start to get more information. What's that really pushing up against for yourself? We're here to learn, we're here to listen, and then afterwards, doing more research or really trying to understand where that reaction was coming from. I guess share the air doesn't necessarily apply because we won't be chatting, but if you find yourself really taking up a bunch of space in the chat, maybe take a step back so folks can feel like they can jump in there. If you're going to be sharing anything about experiences today in the chat or the Q&A, please share from your own experience. Don't share other people's experiences. And please don't out someone's story in the chat or the Q&A. And outing someone means like if you have someone in your life who is trans, non-binary, or two-spirit, and they are like, they don't talk about that out in the world, it's not for you to talk about.
And Zuri, this is Paul. Just to confirm, the chat and the Q are not recorded.
Can you say that again, Paul? I think I missed some of it.
Yeah, the chat and the Q are being recorded.
Okay, sweet. Thank you for that. I guess I probably should have checked with you before I made that. And if you make a mistake today, or you make a mistake ever, say, oh, thank you. I'm sorry, thank you, and move on. Acknowledge the correction. Don't dwell on it, and don't expect the person who's impacted by your mistake to like comfort you, or even necessarily educate you. So challenge yourself to be with your discomfort. Show respect and honor other people's experiences. If you're starting to see something come in the chat, like leave space. And then be solution focused when creating next steps for change. So we're going to dive right in. Here are some things that make us unique. And I first want to acknowledge that this genderbread person here on the left side of your screen is a design by Sam Killerman. And the text is actually from the Gender Unicorn, and that is by the Trans Student Educational Resource group. And I encourage you to all to look up the Trans Student Educational Resources. There's lots of good things there for self-education. So what are some things that make us unique? We have gender identity, gender expression and presentation, sex assigned at birth, sexually attracted to, and then romantically and emotionally attracted to. And sometimes I feel like our dominant culture just takes all of these very unique parts of ourselves and smushes them together. But they're actually each different. And sometimes, we're sexually attracted to people we're also romantically and emotionally attracted to, but all of these pieces we're trying to separate out, and it feels really important in the beginning to separate these out. So I just want to go through each one. Gender identity is one's innermost concept of self, and that can be male, female, two-spirit, non-binary, agender. If you're starting to hear some concepts that you're like, I don't know what this is, that's absolutely okay. And we're going to talk about different gender identities in just a moment. But those are gender identities. And then there's gender expression and presentation. And I think that there's some expectation, of course, that certain genders present or express in a certain way. But that is I feel like a dominant culture binary piece around what is masculinity and femininity. But gender expression is just the external appearance of one's gender identity, usually expressed through behavior, clothing, haircut, voice, makeup, jewelry, things that we sort of put on ourselves to express ourselves to the world. And sometimes it aligns with what the world thinks we should be using, like we were talking about earlier, like certain ideas around who wears jewelry, and sometimes it doesn't align, but it's our gender expression, and it's sometimes very unique to ourselves. There's sex assigned at birth, which is the physical, biological, chromosomal, genetic, and anatomical makeup of a body. And then at the bottom, we have sexually attracted to, the ability to feel sexual desire towards someone. And romantically and emotionally attracted to, which is the ability to be in a romantic relationship, that involves feelings beyond a sexual nature. And then all of this comes together to make who we are as individuals. And if you might be at a point in your life where you realize, like, sometimes things shift a little bit when it comes to who you're romantically attracted to or sexually attracted to. And I think that as we get to know ourselves more, we really come into understanding our gender as well. And I don't think that there's a lot of space in our current dominant culture to explore our gender. And at the piece at the bottom, I really want to reiterate, it's up to you to determine who you are. And you can't make decisions about who someone else is. So here we are with, if you were like, my goodness, this person is like throwing out all these terms. Here we are. There's the trans umbrella. And outside of it, you'll see, I should point with my cursor and not my hands. You'll see cisgender, which we remember from earlier as being someone who is the gender, who feels they are the gender that they were assigned at birth. And we know that from history and science that there are more than two genders and more than two sexes. So on the other side of this gender binary, like that's the dominant culture that's told us that there are only two genders. But we know that that's not true. And we don't have to go very far into any history or very deep into science to see that there's a lot of variance within humans. And that's amazing, right? And we know that Twospirit and other gender variant people exist, have always existed, both on this continent, if you're in the US right now watching this, or globally. We know that XX and XY are not definitive factors in determining gender or sex, nor are they the only chromosomal variations that make up the human population. We know that although social constructs like a gender binary can be really tempting to believe as biological, they're in reality built and maintained by systems of power and control. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that dominant culture that says, this is what it means to be a man, this is what it means to be a woman, and we only have these two options. So when we prioritize a two-gender binary system, which insists that there are only two genders, we are actually being quite harmful. And it often promotes a gender hierarchy. And I think that we see that in our own dominant culture in the US. And this gender hierarchy oppresses women and feminine individuals and non-binary people. All these folks are viewed as subordinate to men, particularly men who epitomize the traits that our dominant culture say have to be within the gender binary. So what is true is that people have different gender and sexual identities that are outside of cisnormative. And cisnormative is, this idea that cisnormative and heteronormative structures, that cisgender and heterosexuality are the right and everything else is wrong. There are gender and sexual identities that are out of the cisnormative and heteronormative standards that have been set by dominant culture. And because human beings are complex, some of our identities change over time. And that's what I was referring to in the last slide. As we get to know ourselves more, we really start to understand our own sexuality and our own genders. And as we learn more, we can be curious and dive deeper into our own truths. So we already went over gender binary. That's the system that reinforces stereotypes, that harms everyone in society. I want that to be very clear. Like, I know I talked about how the gender binary makes women, non-binary, femme individuals subordinate to men, but that harms every single person. including a system where men are viewed in like a higher status. It's hurting everyone, whether you're cisgender, transgender, non-binary, queer. And I think that realizing that it harms everyone is a really important first step to breaking that system down and having solidarity and doing it together. So I want to go through, we've kind of gone through cisgender and gender binary. Before I move on, I just want to make a little bit of space. I know you all can chat, like type things into the chat without interrupting me, but just see like if anyone has any questions. Great. So I want to move on first to transgender. And transgender refers to... Oh, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. This was just sent to me. I'm not familiar with the term Twospirit. What does it mean?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to go over each of these terms. I think I see also, can you go over genderfluid? Absolutely. So I'm going to start with transgender and then kind of going to start here, move this way, hop over, and I'm going to end with Twospirit. But yes, I will get to all of that. So transgender is a term for a person whose gender identity does not conform to the gender they were assigned at birth. And I'm not going to go into it here, but I definitely encourage folks to sort of look into how gender is assigned at birth and some of the really kind of messed up ways that we decide how to assign gender to infants. Like I said, won't go into it here. So trans is sort of this umbrella term that's sometimes used for folks whose gender identity does not match for them what they are assigned at birth. And there is also within that, like, I think the original, sort of some of the original language is around like a binary transgender experience. Like I was assigned one identity at birth, but I'm actually in a binary system, you know, I'm the other gender. And then we get into non-binary. And non-binary is an individual who also sometimes is used genderqueer, non-binary genderqueer. I think genderqueer is a little bit of an older term that many people still use. And it's someone who doesn't identify within the gender binary. They're like, man, woman, what's going on here? Like, I don't fit here. My gender isn't within that system. And the same is for agender, like someone, non-binary is someone who identifies with a gender outside the binary. And sometimes folks get agender and non-binary confused, but non-binary individuals, I should speak from my own experience, I'm non-binary. I know I have a gender, it's just not the binary genders. I'm sort of, in this other space. And agender is when someone doesn't identify with any gender. They're just like, this, none of this is right. I'm not non-binary. I'm not a man or a woman. I'm not, I am in the genderverse. I am in the agender section. And then we have gender fluid. And this is someone whose gender changes. And that could be throughout the course of a day or over the course of a week. Or there's someone who is sort of fluid in different sections of the genderverse. And that could be between man and woman, or that could be really, I keep referring to this genderverse because to me, it's not a spectrum. Like it's this big space where gender exists or no gender exists that we all kind of find ourselves. And Two-Spirit is a contemporary term used to describe Indigenous people who assume cross or multiple gender roles, attributes, dress, attitudes for personal, spiritual, cultural, ceremonial, or social reasons. And these roles are defined by each cultural group and can be fluid over a person's lifetime. And so I would just want to take a moment here to talk about Two-Spirit. This is a term that was created, oh man, I'm not going to know, like recently, in recent history. And this term was created because there was a role in many Indigenous groups of individuals who assume cross or multiple gender roles or attributes, dress, attitudes. And this is an Indigenous role. Like, if you are not Indigenous, you cannot be Two-Spirit. It's a sacred role. And this language, Two-Spirit, was created because for many folks, when they were coming back into their languages, they were trying to refine that word, right? And so there's a whole history of like settler colonialism where languages were lost or terms were lost or roles within Indigenous culture were lost because of settler colonialism and are being re-established and re-honored and openly, right? Like, not necessarily lost to the group, but lost to being able to be shared without violence. And so I just, again, want to reiterate that Two-Spirit is a term, a sacred term, or a term to refer to a sacred individuals within Indigenous communities. You'll see at the top that there are these three terms, not to be assumed under the trans umbrella, although could be, based on the person's identity. And I bring these three up because I think oftentimes people get confuse these terms and put them under the trans umbrella here. And the first one is intersex. And if you aren't familiar with this term, I really, really encourage you to look up intersex justice. Intersex is a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definitions of female or male. Intersex is a socially constructed category that actually reflects real biological variation. And the reason I encourage you all to look this up and learn about this and support intersex individuals is because there's a lot of really sad stuff happening and has been happening. Like, if an infant is born, there's surgeries done that like doctors coerce parents into their infant being put under the knife to fix them. And intersex individuals are just forgotten about, and it's heartbreaking, and I can't do it justice here, but please, like, I encourage you to learn more and support intersex rights. The next individual is, or the next identity is drag performer. And this is a person who is performing drag. And it could be a trans or non-binary or agender or Two-Spirit individual, but not necessarily, right? And the next term is cross-dresser. And again, could be, but making the assumption is actually harmful, that this person or someone who has a cross-dressing identity is trans, non-binary, Two-Spirit.
Zuri,
Yeah.
we have a question in the Q&A box.
Oh, yes.
I am still kind of confused on the difference between agender and non-binary. Can you give another example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me think of how I said it last time, because I don't want to give you the same thing. So non-binary is an identity where someone says, I have a gender. I can feel my gender. And my gender is not within this male-female binary. I am outside of it. I'm non-binary. And agender is someone who says, I feel like I don't feel gender. I look at female gender, male gender, non-binary gender, other genders, and I don't like that. I don't feel that in me. That isn't my identity. I don't have a gender. I'm without a gender. So that A there is sort of without gender. And I hope that sort of clears things up a little bit. But definitely message again if that didn't make sense. And I'm also happy to provide more resources around different identities. Great. So we kind of, before we move on to the next slide, which you all saw a second ago, I want to acknowledge, like, we started off pretty big, right? We talked about the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality. And then we talked about different gender identities. We talked about the gender binary and why it's actually really harmful for everyone. And now I want to kind of come back in and be a little bit more micro and talk about pronouns. And I want to acknowledge that for many folks, they've never had to think about their pronouns, let alone introduce themselves with their pronouns or put their pronouns on their email signature. So I want to start pretty basic. What is a pronoun? And a pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun. Examples are I, you, me, he, she, we, they, someone, everyone. These are pronouns. And I want to share that, like, with pronouns, we all can have a real positive impact on the spaces that we move in. And pronouns are used when we're talking about another person or a group of people, right? Like when we have this pronoun everyone, we're talking about a group of people. And it's very important that when you use a pronoun that you're making sure that it's the correct pronoun. Pronouns are validating. It's acknowledging that you see someone for who they are. And we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, like if you mess up someone's pronoun and that person is kind enough, compassionate enough, has the emotional capacity to correct you in the moment or correct you later, say thank you and then move on. There's nothing more challenging in correcting another person when you have to then hear them apologize or tell you, go on and on and on about how embarrassed they are or how difficult it is, and then tell you about why it's difficult, and then get into a longer conversation about how, it's just hard. And like, I know all those things. It's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging, and you don't do that work in front of a trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individual unless you have a relationship with them where they've said, like, yeah, I want to work through this with you. So sharing pronouns. Actually, I really want to go over a quick term, misgendered. I don't know if I've used that yet, but when you use someone's wrong pronouns or you refer to someone as the wrong gender, you've misgendered them. And depending on where you're at in the country or in the world, depending on the laws that are in play, like this can actually, I find it, especially if you maliciously misgender someone, can really be harassment. And if it's accidental, that's why you're making that correction and you're moving on. And then you're doing the work to make sure that you don't misgender that person again. Mistakes happen, right? But making sure that we minimize our mistakes around pronouns is really important and kind of one of our, I think, tangible steps that we can take to support trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. So when offering pronouns, it's important to not flippantly say, sometimes in meetings that I'm in, we all go around and we introduce ourselves. And it's important to not flippantly say, like, I don't care. Like, I don't care what pronouns you use for me. Because I think that the impact of that, I've heard that have on trans and non-binary and two-spirit individuals who are in those meetings is that, you know, that person doesn't take this seriously. So if you truly don't care, like you're a person who's like, I would feel comfortable for you using any pronoun for me, you can say that. I go by all pronouns. I would feel comfortable for you using any pronoun for me. Thank you for asking. I'm open to whatever pronouns people use for me. Really making sure that our language is supportive. And remember that pronouns are things used to replace nouns. So they can be anything the person who identifies with them wants, no matter whether you think it should be that or not. And people asking people what their pronouns are is always better than assuming what their pronouns are and assigning them a gender. That is misgendering. And everyone, again, gets to decide what pronoun is right for them. And something that I often hear, and you'll see on this screen, is that them can be used as a singular pronoun, but here is a completely grammatically correct use of the singular use of them. And if that's something that you do get hung up on as an individual, like totally acknowledge that. Don't go to someone who uses they, them pronouns to help you through it. There's tons of resources that I'm happy to send out to help support you through that struggle. So here is something that I want you all to just take a note of really quick. I was recently, maybe not so recently, in a college classroom talking about pronouns, and there was this individual who was just like, I'm ready to do this. I want to use my pronouns. I have no idea what they are. Like, I've never thought about this. And I totally empathized with that. And so, you know, this person who eventually was like, oh, my pronouns are she and her, like she, and I talked about ways to practice and finding a person that you can practice with and finding resources that show you like how to practice. And I think that an activity for later that would be really great for folks to do, and it might seem like really simple, is just introducing yourself, saying your name, sharing your pronouns, and then, you know, starting to get it into our brains that our pronouns are an invisible identity that we carry around. So, you know, sharing another invisible identity. Like one that I could share is that I'm a cat owner, which I shared earlier. You couldn't possibly know that just from looking at me. It's one of my invisible identities. We all have them. I really encourage you, especially if you're like, I don't think I'm going to share my pronouns, like practice and see how it feels. And we're going to talk right now about like why does all of this matter? I hear from many cisgender folks like this isn't my issue. You can tell my gender just by looking at me. And what's happening is we're really trying to deconstruct what dominant culture has told us around binary gender and gender presentation. And this is also about the health and safety of, one, all of our community, in particular, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit communities. So why is this important? Well, I want to start with support, and it matters. And I want to just take a second to say that I'm going to share some hard things. And so I think the term is like trigger warning to some really hard information about how the trans, non-binary, two-spirit community is impacted today. And so if you don't want to hear this right now, like I really encourage you to maybe take a break. But if you have capacity, I really encourage you to listen. Support of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community matters because 40% of trans folks attempt suicide within their lifetime. And the truth is that these numbers could be inaccurate because this is only a statistic for attempted suicides and not a reflection of completed suicides. Even in death, trans folks are misgendered. They're misgendered in the information presented in the news. They're misgendered in the information presented in obituaries or by their family who may not have been supportive. And so even information about attempted or completed suicides could be uninformed as a result of that. And 40% is pretty high. It's tragically high. So reasons for high suicide rates are primarily gender-based discrimination, harassment, bullying, abuse, and lack of support from family and friends. The National Transgender Discrimination Survey showed evidence that suicide rates jump 57% when a trans, non-binary, two-spirit person is not supported by their family, and then they decrease when they're supported. And we see this a lot in youth who aren't able to necessarily leave their homes to be able to find community outside of that. It's not safe for them. They don't have resources. So I just like supporting individuals. And if you're wondering, like, how do I support individuals? It just goes right back to that last slide. Like, use someone's name and use someone's pronouns. It's so important for affirming someone's identity and making them feel like a person, is that they're a person that's seen. And so when all members of community are supported and uplifted, our communities are actually safer. There are high rates of homelessness and poverty within the trans, non-binary, two-spirit community. And this is due to youth being kicked out of their homes, discrimination faced in employment and housing. One second, I see a question. Yeah. So discrimination in employment and housing, barriers faced in accessing education, and barriers faced in being able to access shelters. And this also includes barriers to being able to get adequate help. And you might think like, okay, well, what are the barriers in education? If someone doesn't have the resources to get a name change, or they're not in a place where they can get the gender marker on their ID changed, like they can face violence and they can face ridicule and discrimination in just trying to apply to a school. And if you look at the protections within Montana, like we don't have widespread protections for folks for employment and housing discrimination. And so fear tactics around gender identities leads to violence from non-community members. We know that our system currently criminalizes poverty. And so if we have higher rates of poverty due to discrimination faced in employment and housing and accessing higher education, then then we have more the higher rates of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals in our jails and prisons who are not, like, those systems are not equipped to support trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. And it, like, just fills me with such a heartbreaking rage to think about how all of this contributes to oppression for individuals who have gender identities outside of cisnormative standards. So discrimination can make it difficult to earn a living, find long-term housing, access affordable health care, and meet other basic needs. This results in trans people being overrepresented in homelessness and our criminal justice system. You know, unfortunately, the violence and discrimination that many trans people experience in daily life can be even worse while incarcerated. A recent survey illustrated that 24% of trans people in prisons and jails reported being sexually assaulted by another prisoner compared to 2% of all prisoners. I can repeat that again, 24% versus 2%. And if you're in a moment right now where you're like, I don't know what protections there are from workplace discrimination, housing discrimination, and other types of discrimination based on gender identity, I really encourage you to look up your local ordinances or state laws around this. And if there aren't protections or there aren't adequate protections, getting in touch with groups that are working to change that. So why is this important? This is important because trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals are part of our community. This is important because reducing societal stigma matters because we're talking about people's lives. People who are accepted and supported are more productive members in society, are able to make quantifiable contributions. When people feel safe in being who they are, they feel welcome and belonging in their community. This adds diversity, warmth, and richness. When people have accurate information, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people are able to access services, care, housing, employment, healthcare. They're able to access services around getting name changes and gender marker changes. And they're able to live their lives just like all the rest of us want to live our lives. So why is this important? This is a public safety issue. I want to quickly, I know that we're coming down on, show you this table. What can you do? You need to believe someone when they tell you about their identity. You need to be proactive in sharing your pronouns and making sure that you have another person's pronouns correctly by asking them, what are your pronouns? You need to add your pronouns to your email tags, name tags, business cards. If you're an educator, have students write pronouns in addition to their names. Introduce yourself with your pronouns when you're giving a presentation or talking to your class. If you work, you know, I was recently talking to a judge and this judge was like, how do I do this? And I was like, put your pronouns right next to your name in the courtroom. And, you know, this judge maybe had a little bit of a reaction to like, really? But that normalizes pronoun sharing. And for a person in a position of power, that actually is really powerful to say like, I'm gonna do this and other people will follow. We have to interrupt misinformation and harmful language. We have to educate ourselves by watching films by, for, and about trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. And in, you know, reference to when I'm talking about services and care and equality and rights, we have to vote for supportive policies, and we have to vote in elected officials that will create and support these policies. Things to not do. Don't make assumptions about someone's identity, and don't intentionally misgender. Malicious misgendering, I truly believe, is harassment. Ask someone's, never ask someone's real name. That's a dead name, and someone has provided their real name to you, and it feels insulting when people ask that. Never ask someone personal questions about their genitalia or hormones or surgery, or assume anything about that individual. Never use words like tranny, the rest of these, she, male, he, she, ladyboy, thing, it. These are degrading, and just the use of them is malicious and harmful. And never worry about who's in what bathroom. We're there because either to, for number one or number two, or as some people I know, just to get a little breathing space. And never host gender reveal parties. That sets you and your young one up for failure and disappointment. As we learned earlier, that gender is between the ears and not the legs. By having a big party, we're just starting this cisnormative, heteronormative determination of what we think our child should or shouldn't be. Here are some resources. Again, if you've had any, oh, this is a great question. Okay, there's a question on here that says, how can I correct a coworker when they use the wrong pronouns for someone else without creating conflict? It's a great question, and it really depends. And I think that if you have I would pull that coworker aside and say, like, hey, these are this person's pronouns. I would also check in with the person who is being misgendered and say, hey, I heard that this happened. I just want to be here to support you. And does it sound okay if I go have a one-on-one conversation with our coworker? Would you like me to do something different in the future? Would you like me to call that person in front of everyone? How can I support you? And it also really depends. Like, I want to share that I worked in the legislature, and I get misgendered all over the place, and I never ask anyone to correct folks because it doesn't go very well, and it makes me feel unsafe. And so really, really the safety of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals is the most important thing. Thank you for asking that question. Okay, quickly, here are resources available in Montana, and here is TransVisible's email. We're also on social media, and the last thing that I want to say is trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people are not different than you. They are different like you. And I just want to thank all of you for today, for watching and listening, and for anyone in the future who watches this presentation.
Zuri, thank you so much. We have just a couple of minutes before the top of the hour, so we should probably call it there. I see just a couple of last comments coming in. You can probably see those too. And appreciate you sending your email address. That Gmail should have a .com at the end, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, great. I think we'll take a break now, if that's okay. We've got just a few minutes before the top of the hour and our next set of presentations. Zuri, thank you again for the great information and sharing your email address, your contact information, and we will take a break until the top of the hour. It'll be 1 o'clock Montana time. Is there any last words from you?
No. Please email the TransVisible email address if you have any questions or want additional resources.
Wonderful. Zuri, thanks again. We'll take a break. Again, for our attendees, no need to log off. You can just stay online. We're taking a quick break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour. So thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for more.